All right, here we go. Let's pick back up and talk about the war on drugs. We got to talk about the US version of the war on drugs and the Mexican version of the war on drugs. So let's start with the US version. You'll learn more about this in US history next year, but let's just provide a little bit of context. So, technically, the war on drugs began when Richard Nixon was president, but it escalated in the 1980s. Reagan rekindled it. He gave a speech where he literally declared a war on drugs, harkening back to Nixon's policies in an attempt to crack down on drug-related crimes back in the 70s. But in the 80s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was ramping up, and the crack epidemic was also a huge problem. And remember that that HIV can be contracted through the sharing of needles. So drugs and HIV, that's the relationship there. So ultimately, we need to evaluate uh, how the war on drugs relates to migration, how it also relates to the impact of NAFTA, right? When there are reductions of trade barriers, in addition to the growth of legal trade, we're also going to see the growth of illegal trade. So that's how all of this ties into NAFTA. So when Reagan was president, his version of the war on drugs was an increase in legislation. So in the 1980s, he issued a mandatory minimum sentencing law. I forget actually what the sentence was off the top of my head, but ultimately there was an increase in the amount of time that criminals would have to serve, and that depended on what type of drug they were either selling or consuming, etc. So actually, crack cocaine had greater sentences placed on it than powdered cocaine. That's an interesting thing that we could go down a whole rabbit hole on, but we'll save that conversation for US history next year. Um, and another thing that they are ramping up on, in addition to sentencing people associated with drug trade and drug consumption, they're also attempting to stop the exchange of drugs across borders. They're attempting to find shipments and seize those products. So one of the impacts of that is that, of course, the price of drugs will increase because the risk associated with the transportation, the consumption, the trafficking, etc., of those drugs will go up. And so in class, I want us to evaluate that strategy to think about what positive upshots could come from that strategy and did come from that strategy, and also the problems associated with that and the continued problems associated with that, even though that was well over 30 years ago, almost. Yeah. Um, so, anyway, uh, let's also think about how September 11th impacted the war on drugs. So that's interesting. You might not necessarily make that connection. You might think, okay, the post 9/11 foreign policy doctrine was about the war on terror, not the war on drugs. But actually, the way that in particular, the Bush administration viewed that, they did see a connection. They argued that drug trafficking, drug cartels was an example of terror. And so they decided to effectively extend the war on terror into the war on drugs, the continued war on drugs that never ended, even though we had a Democratic president in the middle. I mean, Clinton also continued the war on drugs. Clinton actually passed a huge crime bill in the 1990s that added to mandatory sentencing laws. I could get into that if you guys are interested. But yes, the war on drugs never went anywhere, even though after 9/11, we're way past the 1980s. And so ultimately, the DEA, the Drug enforcement authority was given the ability to go after what they called narco terrorists. So, drug traffickers, drug cartels, leaders of drug cartels. That's what they mean by narco terrorists. The DEA was actually able to go after those people even if they weren't on U.S. soil. A great example of that would be El Chapo, rather, the head of a Mexican drug cartel, who was recently uh, arrested and expedited, or not expedited, extradited to the United States for trial. So, okay, and then we could also get into some of the specifics of how this actually panned out, right? How the war on drugs actually became an extension of the war on terror. Your reading last night talked about something called the Plan Colombia as an example. Also, we can talk about the Meridia Initiative, but basically uh, the gist of that was in your reading. I don't want to spend too much time on these videos, so I'm not going to go into the detail of the Plan Colombia here. But just know in general that this means that the war on terror is by no means something that is directly related to the Middle East, any of that stuff. It goes beyond that. Although, just so you guys realize, drugs don't just get smuggled into the United States from Central America and Mexico. They also certainly do come from other parts of the world. Opiates, for example, also can come from uh, the Middle East and beyond. So, anyway, I digress. We're going to talk about this in class. We're also going to think about the extent to which the war on drugs is a public health issue versus a criminal justice issue. So we'll get a lot deeper in class. Hopefully, you got a chance to look at this as well. This is the one of the byproducts, the results of this shift in America's war on drugs. Right, we're seeing how the increase in incarcerated individuals over time. All right, again, in the effort to keep these short, I do have 2 more slides. They're on Mexico's war on drugs, but it's a little bit of a topic change in a way. So I'm going to do one last video on that. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.